Hey, DawgNation, I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Meriwether Tharp. Good to have you with us here today. Really fun show on tap. We're actually going to bring on a special guest before we're done today. Haven't had Tony Barnhart on in a while. Tony's as great a veteran voice around this sport as exists, knows all these coaches so well, so we'll lean on his expertise before we're done today. Speaking of expertise, Terence Edwards also provides some of that to us there too. We'll talk to Terence here today, as we always do. Interesting look at the Georgia quarterback competition on the program today. I think you'll like this. We'll get to that here coming up in just a moment. And off the top of the show here, we've also got some words I've been kind of waiting to hear, and it's been kind of slow to come by during the offseason for reasons that I'll never fully understand, but we've finally gotten a chance to hear it. And if you're a Georgia fan, I think that's a really good thing. Now, let me also say this. I know yesterday we had the streaming issue again. I've heard from some of you on that. Look, I take this very seriously. I know the folks behind the scenes here take it very seriously there as well. All I can tell you is that my earnest hope is this is going to be fixed soon. Now, I'm not very smart, so I can't tell you what the solution to the problem is necessarily, but my earnest hope is this is going to be fixed very soon. So I'm going to ask you a favor. Be patient with us for a second. If you see something, let me know about it. Some of you have, and I appreciate that. And we'll just kind of see where it goes. But obviously, that is something that we need to get fixed in terms of a streaming issue if you've encountered that on video. So we take that very, very seriously, and I just wanted to say that to you off the top of the show today. Now, with that out of the way, let's get ready to have some fun. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Meriwether Tharp, and it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Meriwether Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at theatlantadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
I feel like I don't ask a lot out of life. I like to think of myself as a fairly low-maintenance guy. Now, if my wife were here, she might tell you a different story, but I like to think of myself as a little bit of a low-maintenance guy. I don't have a lot of big requests. If I was like a musician, I would, the rider, like the thing that contracts have where you have to have all green M&Ms, whatever else. I don't feel like my rider in life is very long in terms of the required things I have to be able to show up and operate. I hope that's the case anyway. But there has been a thing that I've sort of asked from college football during this offseason, and it has been amazing how difficult this has been to come by. And yet we finally have some evidence that might be changing. We finally have some evidence that people are doing what they should have been doing over the course of the entirety of these last few months, and I, for one, am very happy about that. Let me give you a reminder here, and we're going to tell you what's out there here right now. What we have said is, listen, in the overall conversation about college football, which we love being a part of, even if Georgia didn't exist, if you waved a magic wand, the dogs disappeared, listen, college football would still be my favorite thing, and I'd still love talking about college football. And if you want to have the conversation, and you've probably heard me say this before, if you want to have the conversation of, can Ohio State finally beat Michigan for the first time after losing to them 2 straight years? That's a really interesting conversation. I'd love to be able to have that. Can Texas take advantage of a final year against weak Big 12 competition before joining the SEC with a really strong quarterback and an overall roster? That's a fun conversation. I'd love to have it. Are you sad about the end of the the Pac-12? It seems like that conference is about to disappear. This is sort of the last year of classic Pac-12. Are you somewhat interested in that? As a football fan, of course I am. So I'm not one of these sort of meathead Georgia guys, not that there are a lot of those anyway, but I'm not some meathead Georgia guy that's only interested in the dogs. Georgia is my favorite team, but college football is my favorite sport, and I'm sort of here for the rest of the sport in a similar fashion to the way in which I'm here for Georgia football on a regular basis. But what I have said is, not just as a UGA partisan, but as someone who has an appreciation for the history that's playing out in front of us and potentially where that could go here this season, that if you want to talk about Michigan or Ohio State or Alabama or LSU or Texas or USC or fill-in-the-blank team, if you want to talk about any of those teams, that's fine, but you got to talk about Georgia first. It's the line that Roman Reigns, the professional wrestler, uses. Acknowledge me. If you want to make a case for someone else winning the national championship, those sort of arguments around college football are fun to have, but acknowledge Georgia first. The way I've said this before is, is if you want to make the case for someone else, you better have a very tangible, logical case against Georgia. In other words, you better be willing to explain why Georgia's not going to win it before you're able to explain why someone else is going to win it. That is the kind of conversation deserving a team like Georgia, which has won the last 2 national championships. And for those of us who think of us as media types, and by the way, I don't think of myself as a reporter. That's not what I do. I don't think of myself as a journalist. That's not what I'm interested in. But I am in the media, right? So this goes beyond just, the scribes, the sports writers, things like that. This is anybody who speaks into a microphone, anyone who goes on TV, goes on the radio, exists on the internet. For those of us that are a part of the college football media landscape, I think the important thing for us is both in recognizing that Georgia is on paper right now the very best team in college football, but also beyond that, recognizing that if Georgia wins the national championship here this year, if it, as we say around here, if it will able to go for 3 in 23, then that is an accomplishment unlike anything this sport has ever seen. And it's amazing to me how slow it has been for some folks to kind of come to that realization that what Georgia has been able to do the last couple of years sets itself up for something unprecedented here this year. That back-to-back national championships in and of itself is an amazing accomplishment, but it's not necessarily a historic accomplishment. Alabama did it last decade. We've seen Nebraska. You can go back and cite examples of teams that have won back-to-back national championships. But Georgia is also favored to now win a 3rd straight national championship, and that's where the historic nature of the conversation really, really changes. And finally, it would appear that someone's recognizing this to the degree to which they should. His name is Dennis Dodd. He is a writer for CBSSports.com. And Dennis had a piece up this week where he looked at the top storylines of the upcoming season. And right there at the very top of the list, exactly where it should be, was the situation for Georgia and its chance to win a 3rd straight national championship. And Dodd sums it up quite succinctly exactly what this might mean if Georgia's able to do this. And I love the way that he says this, so much so that I'm going to read it to you. Let me show you here on the screen a sentence from Dodd. These Bulldogs, Dennis says, are on the brink of completing the greatest run of all time. That's it. That is what's at stake for Georgia here this year. If Georgia wins a national championship this season, it will be the greatest run of all time. Now, Bama fans, I don't want to hear it. If Georgia wins a 3rd straight national championship, the greatest run of all time. Florida State fan from the 90s, top 5 this, top 5 that, blah, 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 blah. I don't want to hear it. If Georgia wins a national championship this year, 3 straight national championships in this era, that would be the greatest run of all time. So let me approach this idea from a couple of different vantage points here for a moment. First of all, for those of us who are Georgia fans, and as I've said before, we like arguing, right? That's how we pass the time between now and when the season begins. For the long off season, our sport has the longest off season, so therefore we spend that time during the off season arguing about stuff. How'd you like to have the ultimate trump card? How would you like to have the ultimate checkmate in any argument about anything ever? For all that you've heard over the course of your lifetime, no matter how long your lifetime has been, about 1980 this or whatever that, how would you like to have the ultimate checkmate in any discussion like this forever going forward? That my team put together the greatest run of all time. And I believe that what Dennis Dodd describes there would be true. Now, it hasn't happened yet. 2 straight national championships is not enough to be that. 2 straight national championships is really, 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 really good. 3 straight national championships is an achievement without a rival. It is an achievement without a comparative performance. There's nothing out there that would be like 3 straight national championships. That means if Georgia can pull this off, if Georgia can go for 3 in 23, we joke all the time about Georgia fans being tough to take. Let me tell you something. Georgia fans will no longer just be tough to take. Georgia fans will be unable to be argued with. Folks may really finally leave you alone. Folks may finally sort of step back and truly bend the knee, as probably they should have all along anyway. If you're able to go out there and watch your team go for 3 in 23, it's one of the reasons why the stakes are so high for this upcoming season, because the level of history that you would have on your side would be unlike anything. And listen, there are some sports where like 3 straight would not mean quite as much. Like if you care about baseball, over the course of the long history of Major League Baseball, there have been a handful of teams that won 3 straight World Series, right? So like 3 straight championships in and of itself is not necessarily the end-all be-all. We've seen a few NBA teams in my lifetime, right? Win 3 straight. Lakers did early 2000s. Bulls did it twice, 2 different times. So in some sports, 3 straight doesn't quite mean the same thing because it does happen from time to time. But in college football, it means a lot more because just given the overall parity in the sport, and I know sometimes it doesn't seem like college football has parity, but when you've got so many teams across even just the Power 5 landscape to play, it's more opportunities to create championship-type teams. So from that standpoint, there possibly is more parity in college football than there is in professional sports, just given the fact that professional sports typically only have about 30 teams in the league. So 3 straight championships doesn't mean the same thing in NBA, Major League Baseball. We kind of sometimes see that. But it means a ton in college football, and it would be an achievement unlike any other. And if you're a Georgia fan, you ought to have just an insatiable appetite for that opportunity because it gives you unprecedented power to win any argument you have forever going forward until somebody else does this. And that, to me, is a really valuable thing. But, and I can already hear the retorts to this, BA, be careful. BA, calm down here. Let's not get out in front of ourselves here a little bit because there is still the remnants of the very old, tired, stale notion of rat poison. That, well, if they're praising you like this, if someone like Dennis Dodd's talking about you potentially going on the greatest run of all time, then that's somehow a dangerous thing and somehow the kind of thing that stands in Georgia's way. Kirby Smart himself has talked about complacency, of course. But here's what I'm here to tell you. This is not about complacency, in other words, thinking you've already arrived. This is about massive focus for what you are able to achieve. Like, there is a book that has a lot of national champions in it, and Georgia's in it right now. But you want a book that's only got 1 page, only got 1 team on it? That's what Georgia can do here this year. So talking about the idea of a 3rd straight national championship shouldn't breed complacency. It should breed an intensity of focus unlike anything ever before because you get a chance to achieve unlike anything ever before. So rat poison, I think, the old notion that if they say something too good about you, it's overall bad for you, I don't think that's got any place in this discussion for that reason. And beyond that, I'd say this as well, is that I think this Georgia team is also sort of past that too. I think rat poison is sort of a tired, stale, out-of-fashion idea, period. But I think this Georgia team in particular is just sort of motivated by different things. It's not motivated by having guys like me pat them on the back. If you listen to the Georgia coaches, what it's motivated by is showing up every day and working as hard as you possibly can with the unspoken reminder that if you don't, someone else in this roster probably is, and that's the guy who's going to get the spot that you wish you had for yourself. And I thought this was very well described by Georgia co-defensive coordinator Glenn Schumann when he spoke to the media here this week. Schumann's a guy we obviously really like, and he's a guy that's coming into his own as a coach, and the way in which he speaks on behalf of this Georgia defense is perhaps maybe the best example of just how true that is. And one of the things that Schumann talked about was, in light of the fact that Georgia has won 2 straight national championships, in light of the fact that it could achieve, as Dennis Dodd, I believe, correctly calls, the greatest run of all time, how do you maintain that standard, knowing that you've gotten this far on this journey? How do you finish it off here, at least the next chapter of that, by winning a 3rd straight national championship? How do you maintain that standard? I thought Schumann's answer to that question earlier this week was outstanding. This is what Glenn had to say.
The thing about a standard is that once you set it, you have to uphold it every single day. And so when we go out to practice today, we're not worried about the results that are going to come when we get to play our opponents this fall. We're worried about how can we uphold the standard today. We constantly measure things to hold guys accountable in terms of our results as a team defense in the prior day's practice. We show it to them when we fell short, okay? Then we have to be accountable to that and demand that we do better the next day. We chart things in terms of individual measures of things that really matter to playing great defense. The effort that you play with, you have to out-hustle people ultimately to play defense. The physicality you play with, you have to out-hit people to play defense at a high level, and your competitive nature, you have to out-compete people. So the number one way we're going to uphold the standard, we're going to measure, did we out-hit people? Did we out-hustle people? Did we out-compete people? And if we do that, you're successful playing defense at just about any level of football.
Quick question to sum all this up. Does that sound like a coach who leads a unit likely to be tripped up by rat poison? Does that sound like a coach who leads a unit, the Georgia defense, likely to succumb to the notion of complacency or anything like that? No, what that sounds like to me is a coach who leads a portion of a football team who could be fully capable of doing what Dennis Dodd at CBS Sports described there a moment ago. completing a run unlike anything we've ever seen in what is essentially the modern version of college football history, dating back to the start of the AP poll and things along those lines. It is a special level of history. And it would be inappropriate not to acknowledge it. Y'all, it would be inappropriate not to appreciate it. We've seen good football teams before. We've seen back-to-back national champions. We've seen multi-time champions in the college football playoff era. Clemson won 2 titles over the course of a 3-year span. So we've seen stuff before that's similar to what Georgia's done here thus far. But we're led to believe that Georgia might only just be getting started. And there could be truly a go for 3 in 23 national championship on tap for these Dogs here this year. And if that happens, truly history will have been made. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented by Meriwether Tharp. Hello to you. Happy to have you with us, no matter how you get to us across all platforms, video, podcast, radio, just a lot of ways to connect. Thanks to you for doing so, whichever one of those you choose to use, including, by the way, 945 on DawgNation.com, the DawgNation app there as well. First and 15, special content. Before we get going anywhere else, we give that to the folks who show up to our own platform, because that's what the business folks like. So show up here at DawgNation.com or on the DawgNation app. We'll give you a little bit of extra content just as a way of saying thank you to all of that. And by the way, I also say thank you there as well for your acknowledgement of our great sponsors, including our sponsor for today, our friends at Meriwether Tharp. Now listen, I realize that you sort of hope you don't need Meriwether Tharp. I do understand that. You sort of hope that maybe that's a call I don't ever have to make. But here's what I'm going to tell you. Whether you need this or not, the truth is someone you know in your life will probably kind of bump into a divorce situation at some point in time. You understand that, right? Statistically speaking, divorce is just a fact of life for a large portion of an audience the size of ours. So I hope that you don't ever need to make this call either. I really, really do. I hope that's not something you ever need to do. But if it is, I'm going to tell you right now, I believe there'll be a strong advocate for you. And maybe if you don't need to make this call yourself, you will remember what I have said before. And I think sometimes when you have a conversation, you're talking to a buddy at a bar, or you're talking to a friend at brunch, or whatever it is that people do. You're having that conversation, and the word divorce comes up. You sort of don't know what to say back sometimes. Well, this is something you can say back. If this is what you feel like is a reality, if this is the kind of thing that you feel like you have to go through, then I think maybe making sure you've got a strong advocate by your side might be the best way to get through it. You've heard me say that to you before. That's something you can say to somebody else if you hear them going through that situation. That's what my friends at Meriwether Tharp are all about. Y'all, I couldn't sit here, make these recommendations, talk to you about this as candidly as I do if I didn't truly believe it. And I have seen the work they've done. I've heard personal testimonies of the work they've done for people who kind of find themselves going through that divorce process. A scary and confusing time, but a better future on the horizon because they've taken the guidance that Meriwether Tharp provides. So please find them online. It's theatlantadivorceteam.com, theatlantadivorceteam.com. And based on all the free resources they have there on the website, you will find out what I've been telling you for years, that Meriwether Tharp is truly your source for Georgia divorce. So find them online, theatlantadivorceteam.com. We are so busy here today. That includes to 9 of the DawgNation video channels. We'll tell you more about that before we're done. Special guest today before we're done there as well. We'll welcome in for the first time in a while here Tony Barnhart onto the program, Mr. College Football himself. That'll be a cool thing to do prior to our conclusion. Terence Edwards here in a minute there also. I've got some Georgia quarterback stuff here coming up in about 60 seconds there, too, so that's going to be a fun conversation. But prior to that, let me give you the latest announcement here for our Kroger Celebrating Teachers winner. We've had a great week rolling off these names each day of the week. Kroger loves celebrating teachers. We get back to school, and we are so proud here on DawgNation Daily. They use our platform as a way of doing all of that. So let's celebrate today's winner. It's Mary Elizabeth O'Neill. Shane nominated Mary Elizabeth here, so we're so happy for Shane doing that. Mary's in her 13th year of teaching. Taught 4 years at Pierce County High School, a great high school football program, by the way. And she taught Stetson Bennett his freshman year. How about this? So Mary actually taught Stetson Bennett when Stetson was a freshman, so did a great job there, obviously, and also taught with Georgia Cyber Academy for 8 years there as well, and with Brantley County High School this year, too. So she actually graduated herself from Brantley High Salutatorian, Waycross College, and finished up there at Valdosta State, one of the great universities here in our state. Also, wonderful mother, wife, and teacher. And it's also important to remember, one of the reasons why we celebrate these teachers the way that we do is because they're doing these great things in the classroom, but that doesn't change the task at home, right? Good mothers, good fathers, good husbands, good wives, taking care of business at home while also taking care of our kids while they're at school. And that's why we love celebrating these teachers and why we're so happy to celebrate Mary today, obviously because of the great work she's doing, but also kind of the cool add-on to that, the fact that she actually taught Stetson Bennett. So that's a really cool thing. So Mary, congratulations to you. You get a great collection of gift cards coming your way, courtesy of our friends at Kroger. And Shane, thank you for making the nomination. We'll make you a winner today, too, for doing that. All right, so good stuff there. Terence Edwards here in a moment. For now, though, let's go around the doghouse. Presented today by ServPro. And let me give you a nickel's worth of free business advice here for a moment. If you're trying to start a business, and this is not in read, this is content. Just give me a second, I'll get there. If you're starting a business, everybody wants their product or their service to be better than the competition. But the truth is that better is somehow kind of in the eye of the beholder a little bit, and better is a very difficult target to actually hit. That, well, I'm going to be better than the competition. But better is a very nondescript thing that oftentimes doesn't leave you aiming at anything specific enough. Instead, what I would rather be if I'm in business, some sort of thing like that, tell me how you're different, right? Different is just a better target than better because different is easier to hit. What you hope is the things that make you different in the eyes of the audience, the eyes of the marketplace, make your product or service better. But different is the distinction that gives you a chance to succeed. That's just a nickel's worth of free advice. Do with that what you will. Now, there is a obvious comparison with that and Georgia football there too, because we would say there are a lot of things that make Georgia football different than its competition. And the results of the last 2 years would lead us to believe that the things that make Georgia different also make it better. They are, after all, you may have heard, two-time national champions here. And another example may be out there of just how different Georgia football is right now than the teams that it's competing with. Look at maybe the most important position of all on the field, the quarterback spot. Georgia right now is in the battle where it's going to try to find its quarterback for the 2023 season, and the trio of guys are in that competition. We're led to believe that Carson Beck's probably the leader. Brock Vandegrift, the next most seasoned guy in that quarterback situation, he may be the number two. And the guy that's also making a push, but's been here just a little less long, is Gunnar Stockton. All three of these guys were players that Georgia recruited out of high school, and all three of these guys have now been at Georgia for at least a year, if not longer than that. They are not transfers. They've never transferred. They haven't transferred from anywhere else. So far, they haven't shown much of a desire to transfer to anywhere else. They are guys who have just stayed at Georgia, learned the system, participated in the culture, and now they're competing to be the next starting quarterback at UGA. And as we watch this play out over the course of the next couple of weeks during practice before the season begins, I just think it's important to acknowledge just how different that makes Georgia than the teams it's competing with. And this perhaps is another example why Georgia's differences also make it better. Let me give you a stat here that kind of explains this. Our friends over at 24/7 Sports put this out. When you look at the landscape across college football right now, the idea that Georgia's got three quarterbacks, none of which are transfers, that makes Georgia quite different than at least the majority of teams in college football here right now. 24/7 Sports showing us that they call it the transfer portal era of college football. Over 60%, they say, of the projected Power 5 starting quarterbacks here this year are transfers. Chris Hummer, the writer, letting us know that. So the majority, more than 60% of starting quarterbacks this year in Power 5 are expected to be transfer players, yet all three of Georgia's quarterbacks are not transfers. Now, that in itself is really interesting, but I think what makes this a little bit more compelling, possibly, not to dispute the stuff from 24/7 Sports there, but this idea that in this particular year we're in the age of transfer quarterbacks. I'd also say this, that perhaps as big a story, if not a bigger story for this year, is not the proliferation of transfer quarterbacks, but it's actually kind of who didn't transfer, right? I mean, Drake May supposedly got a 7-figure offer to leave North Carolina to come to the SEC. May himself said that a couple of weeks ago, but he didn't leave. Grayson McCall didn't leave Coastal Carolina. McCall playing for a better team could have been a pretty big deal. The Tulane quarterback didn't leave over the course of the offseason. There had been some rumors at one point in time he might go to Florida. He stays the Green Wave. Tulane was in the preseason top 25 after obviously being one of the darlings of bowl season a year ago. You can cite other examples where as big a story as the fact there are so many transfer quarterbacks is that some of the best quarterbacks who maybe could have been this year's version of Caleb Williams, a guy who goes to a new team and makes that team kind of an instant contender, at least at first blush, a lot of those guys didn't go anywhere. So the fact that Georgia has kept Carson Beck for as long as it has kept Brock Vandagriff, even after a spring in which a lot of folks were kind of assuming that Beck may have ascended into the role of starter, that obviously Gunnar Stockton shows no signs of exiting this competition anytime soon. The fact that Georgia's able to bring in touted quarterback recruits, keep them in the program for multiple years, that really does allow Georgia to stand out because teams are so desperate for quarterback that more than half of them, far more than half of them, are going to the portal for their starter. And in a few cases, teams that were maybe hopeful to get a great high-level quarterback from the transfer portal, they didn't get that guy because that guy didn't enter into the transfer portal. And so here you have Georgia saying, we don't need to play that game right now because we are recruiting and holding on to quarterbacks coming out of high school. That is a very valuable commodity for UGA. So keep this in mind here today. Later on, we'll hear from Georgia offensive coordinator Mike Bobo. One of the things that Bobo is going to talk about in this press conference that he's going to do today is the state of this Georgia quarterback competition involving Beck and Vandagriff and Stockton there as well. We'll hear more from Kirby Smart on this on Saturday. Some of the more well-heeled among us will also be a part of the scrimmage there inside Sanford Stadium on Saturday. Some of the McGill donors, things like that, will be invited to be a part of that. Rumor stuff will come flying in on all this. And so by the time this week is done, we're going to have more insight into where things actually stand with the Georgia quarterback competition. Guys who have stayed here, guys who've invested time in all of this, making Georgia different than other programs. And I'm reminded of something that former Georgia quarterback Jake Fromm said on Friday, that when Bobo talks today, if someone's doing well in this competition, whether it's Beck, the perceived leader, or a guy like Vandagriff who's trying to close that gap, Kirby Smart, when he talks on Saturday, much the same way, that if there is something positive to be said about any of these quarterbacks, the odds are the Georgia coaches, Bobo today, Kirby on Saturday, they might not withhold that as much as you might think they might want to. When it comes to quarterback, they may not always keep their cards as close to the vest as you might think. And perhaps, according to Jake Fromm, there may be a reason from time to time that Kirby Smart opens up and gives you a little bit more. Perhaps even words of praise if he thinks they're warranted for reasons that are understood well by Smart. That's what Jake Fromm told us last week. Let me give you a reminder right now.
For the most part, I mean, in my opinion, I think Kirby, for a lot of things, is an open book. Will call things as he sees it, even to the media space as well. And then also, too, sometimes he will throw things out there in the media to see how his players react to hearing what he said, if that makes sense. Like, hey, if someone, is getting praised, hey, how is he going to handle that? Because, that would be an indicator of how he would handle it throughout the season after a good game or something. How is he going to handle it and go and respond the next week? And play and prepare for the next week's game. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that Coach thinks about and does and says for particular reasons. And, sometimes we figure things out and sometimes we'll never know.
So let's keep that in mind. The Georgia quarterbacks have all stuck around. They have chosen to participate in this competition. They haven't entered the transfer portal the way so many of their brethren have. 24/7 Sports reported that. And now we'll find out where things are going to shake out. And as Jake Fromm says, the odds are Mike Bobo, Kirby Smart, they may be pretty candid in coming days about exactly where things stand for this quarterback situation as we get ready for the 2023 season. That is Around the Doghouse. It is presented today by our friends at ServPro. And, of course, if you are dealing with a situation where you see damage to your home caused by fire, water intrusion, something like that, it's one of the most disappointing scenarios you can probably face as a homeowner because you're kind of left to wonder, how can this ever be put back together again? How can we ever get this back to the way that it's supposed to be? Well, that's where our friends at ServPro step in here. Their restoration specialists can clean your mess up, put it all back together and leave it like it never even happened. That's what ServPro is famous for. And each franchise independently owned and operated there as well. So you can trust them to take great care of you because their business relies on your satisfaction, and they've been satisfying people for a very long time. So if you've got your own home or a commercial property, or some sort of rental property that's dealing with damage caused by fire or water intrusion or something along those lines, let the restoration specialists from ServPro do great work for you. I want you to find them online. It's servpro.com, S-E-R-V. Servpro.com for a lot more on that, and they can get you cleaned up like it never even happened. We're so happy to have ServPro as a part of Around the Doghouse here today. All right, before we are done, reminder about a fun show coming up on DawgNation tonight. We will give you that. That's good stuff. We got off to a great start last week. It continues here this week. We'll do that. Then also Mr. College Football Tony Barnhart stopping by there as well. But for now, everything about these dogs as they roll through camp, getting ready for the big season on the way. Let's talk to an expert who understands it all so well. It's former Georgia wide receiver Terence Edwards here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
I am late getting to Terence Edwards, so I apologize for that. I want to jump right into it and make good use of his time. Terence, I was talking about quarterbacks before you joined us. We're going to hear today from offensive coordinator Mike Bobo. Obviously, Saturday we'll hear again from Kirby Smart after a really pretty pivotal scrimmage inside Sanford Stadium. And my guess is we'll hear some sort of candid remarks, as we were saying a minute ago, from both these coaches about kind of where things stand. Is Beck still the clear leader? Is Vandergrift closing that gap, if there even indeed was a gap? I think we're about to start finding some of that kind of stuff out. What do you expect to hear, and what do you expect to kind of see from the quarterback situation at this point in the fall camp period here? What's your expectation for quarterback right now?
We saw it in the spring game. I think Beck is by far right now the better quarterback, the quarterback that understands the offense the best, even though we're kind of changing to Mike Bobo philosophy. I think the terminology, will stay the same. So he has a good grasp on what they're trying to do offensively. And what do I think we're going to hear after that? Nothing. I don't think we'll hear anything. I don't think there's anything that's going to come out of the scrimmage from Kirby Smart, anybody else that lead us to believe that one way or the other. I don't think that's the way that any coach's role. You're not going to get anything out of Nick Saban, and I don't think you're going to get much out of Kirby Smart.
I think my concern about that ends up being true is, you go back and look at kind of recent history under Kirby, oftentimes no news sort of turns out not to be good news. We didn't hear much before the 2020 season. Come to find out, Georgia had itself a pretty messy situation at quarterback there for a while. Back in 2021 when JT was dealing with injury prior to the UAB game, we didn't hear much about that either. That was kind of a very secretive process. And come to find out, whatever concerns existed there was sort of enough to kind of take him out of the starting role because you're led to believe maybe Georgia just wasn't quite so sure they could depend on him to be healthy. That when you look through the years under Kirby Smart, when there is no news coming out, oftentimes that absence of news does not mean good news for the program. So I guess I have to say I sort of hope you're wrong about that. I sort of hope we do hear, something for the positive, because we don't hear much of anything. Then maybe I guess you'd be left to be concerned that maybe no one's stepping up to the degree in which they should.
I mean, that's the way to look at it. But just historically, just any college program, not Georgia alone, not exclusively for the others, that you don't try to give the opponents that you play a lot of newsworthy notes. You don't try to get anyone. You try to keep everything in-house, good or bad. You try to keep it in-house. That's for the coaches and the players to kind of not read what's going on in the paper, especially at that quarterback position. That we all know that's a delicate position, and I can understand your point of view. But just being around coaches, professional and high school, you just try to keep that under wraps as much as possible. And I don't believe, good or bad, there are going to be much details that Kirby's going to give us. I mean, if he give us that he went 10 for 15, 200 yards, or if he went 2-3 interceptions, I think that's going to stay in-house and let everyone speculate what's going on inside the program.
I said this a little earlier this week. You mentioned Mike Bobo. I think the maybe biggest question for Georgia to answer right now is how Bobo steps in as a replacement for Todd Monken. Now, my belief is he'll probably do pretty well. I think the Bobo is actually pretty good here the first time around. But you look at the overall point total, Terence, 50 in the SEC championship, 40-plus in the Peach Bowl, 65, of course, in the national championship game. That's a massive performance in 3 postseason games for Georgia a year ago, and you look at the dramatic improvement that the Todd Monken offense has showed the 3 years that he was here, better than really anything on a single-season basis prior to that I don't think there's any doubt that Monken does leave big shoes to fill. We're going to hear from Mike Bobo here today, and the discussion about what he does to maintain the unprecedented level of offensive success that Georgia enjoyed while Monken was here. Terence, I do have to say, I think that's a really big question. Do you agree with that for this upcoming season, how Bobo steps in and keeps the machine rolling that has been the Georgia offense these last couple of years?
Yes, I think real or fake, however you want to look at Bobo the first time around, I thought he did a great job. We averaged a lot of points. I just don't think both sides of the ball was equal at that time. He didn't have the defense or the talent that we have right now. So it's some pressure on Coach Bobo to come in and keep this thing going. And I can tell you this, I saw B-Max about a month ago, and we were just sitting there talking, and he was just sitting there talking about Bobo and Monk, and he said Bobo is in his top 5 of offensive coaches that he's coached with. Wow. Joe Moorhead out in Oregon was one of the better play callers that he's been around. He said Todd Monken was definitely one of the better play callers. And he said Mike Bobo is right there right along with him. So with B-Mac telling me that, with the connections that I do have with Mike, I understand his football acumen and what he did the first time. Even though, a lot of people, just wasn't too impressed, I was. We did a lot of great things. Just the talent level was not the same as now, especially on the defense side of the ball. So you take that talent with his explosive offenses that he's been prone to have, even with Aaron Murray. I mean, you look at Aaron Murray, he is the all-time leading passer, and it was up under Mike Bobo. So just give that same type of offense with the defense they have, and I do expect our offense to continue to roll, and in the passing game, maybe even better.
It's an interesting comparison to make there. That's a lot of fun to think about. I want to ask you about this because Georgia fans are really talking about this right now, and we've got some confirmation here based on what's been seen at Georgia practice, based on what's been reported, various places, that Kendall Milton, the Georgia running back, is kind of dealing with a hamstring injury. Obviously, that took him off the field for spring practice this past year, or I should say this past spring, and kind of one of those things that's been an issue for him now for multiple years there at UGA. And I think some people are kind of trying to make sense of this right now. I've told our audience I'm still a believer that Kendall can have a really big year for Georgia, that I haven't heard anything yet that can't be shaken off, and that he can't still be a very productive player in what's kind of really supposed to be his showcase year. And at the same time, I do get why this is a conversation, because it has been one of those things that's been kind of a multi-year story here for right now. As someone who knows the game, knows injuries, knows taking care of your body, knows all that kind of stuff, what do you make of the fact that the Milton hamstring thing is still a topic now in what's supposed to be the big year for Kendall at UGA?
I can tell you this. I can tell you, we all know Ron Corson is the GOAT at Georgia. He is the best in the.
Did we lose Terence?
Something is chronically going on with this hamstring if Ron Corson cannot stop that, or the strength conditioning can stop that. So that's my first thought. And I just look at the schedule, and if he's out for the first few games and the schedule dictates that it's not great opponents, we can afford to hold him out, because we are luxury of having depth at that position. But I'm with you. I was looking for Kendall to be the guy, be the main ball carrier this year. I just assumed that he was going to be injury-free. It's his time to shine. But one thing we do have is we have a stable of running backs that can come in and compete. Branson Robinson, Andrew Paul. So we have a lot of backs there. And, it's not a knock on the backs, but I think that's the easiest position to translate into college football. And we have some capable guys that we've recruited. So not too worried about that position, but I would definitely love to see Kendall have a healthy year, because I think he is such a great talent.
So this is one of those things, as not being a former player, I guess I just don't know. When a hamstring thing like this kind of comes around, is this solely a product of bad luck? Is there something either the training staff or the player himself can do to prevent that? Like, how much of this is the kind of thing that you can play defense against, so to speak, and how much of this is just a series of bad luck for a guy like Kendall?
I think there's a lot of times it's bad luck because we have one of the best strength and conditioning. We have one of the best medical teams out there. So this can't be on them, in my opinion. I think it's bad luck because hamstrings, just like growing, which I had, can feel great. And it can feel great for a few weeks, and you continue to do your rehab, your strengthening, and it just goes again. So I just hope Kendall could get past this in training camp and run coursing, and the strength and conditioning continue to strengthen all his limbs, both hamstrings, his quads, his glutes, his lower back, which is all those are connected. And we can see him for a full season, especially for the stretch run when the SEC play comes. We definitely need a talent like him to help us win games. I
want to be respectful of your time, so let me squeeze in one more before we let you go. Did you see, and I know like the watch lists are not, official type thing or whatever, but did you see where Brock Bowers won the watch list for the Biletnikoff Award, nation's top wide receiver? Like, how much fun would it be if that were to actually happen? If Bowers has the kind of year we think that he does, a guy who at one point in time won the Mackey Award as the top tight end could also be honored as kind of like the best pass catcher overall, winning the Biletnikoff Award like that. It's been really fun this summer, Terence, to see Bowers get the attention that I believe he deserves. He doesn't want it, but he deserves getting it. And even if it's not all that important, I was kind of glad to see the Biletnikoff Award kind of give him a little bit of a nod earlier this week.
I was a little thrown back a little bit because, the tight end have their own award. Why is the greatest tight end I've ever seen in Georgia is coming over here trying to steal the receivers award? So I was a little like, hold up, Brock, stay in your lane over there now. You can have the Mackey Award. Let the receivers have their own award. But no, he deserves it. If it's considered the best pass catcher, with him and Morrison Harrison Jr., in my mind, are the two best pass catchers right now. And it's not limited to just being a tight end. But I was like, you got the Mackey Award over there now. You can't win both. What if they gave him both? So I had a little fun with it, but he deserves it.
Terence, great stuff. Remind folks that they can find the Terence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy online.
You can find me on all social media platforms at Terence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy.
Terence, have a great week. We'll talk to you soon, okay?
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
So Terence says, hey, how come you guys are wanting to steal the thunder from the wide receivers for a guy like Brock Bowers? That's very funny. I think the response to that might be, if Bowers had beef with the Mackey Award, I think he'd have every right to do that, right? Because remember, a couple of years ago, they didn't even nominate him as a finalist, but he had 13 touchdowns. So if he wanted to say, hey, listen, this year I'm only going after the Biletnikoff. I'm not going after the Mackey Award anymore because you guys shortchanged me in the past. He might be well within his rights to do that. Either way, let's get ready to go cruise around the SEC courtesy of Royal Caribbean. Remind you, fun things going on with Royal Caribbean, including the DawgNation cruise there as well. We hear from people all the time who continue each week now to be booking that DawgNation cruise, being on board Allure of the Seas with us coming up in April. That's April of 2024, next spring. It's April 22nd through the 26th, leaving out of Port Canaveral, going to Nassau in the Bahamas, and Perfect Day Coco Cay. Because if I'm sailing to Perfect Day Coco Cay. That's just the way that is. It's probably my favorite place in the world. Always have fun there. Occasionally have too much fun, but it's always a great time. So if we want to have you on board to have a great time with us, bigger and better than it's ever been before, online, RoyalDogs.com for a lot more on that. We're going to get Tony Barnhart here coming up in just a couple of minutes. Let me do a couple of quick SEC stories before we get there on that. Speaking of CBSSports.com, we talked about them off the top of the show. Another fun story that I saw at CBS Sports the other day was Tom Fornelli, the writer, looking at the teams that could so-called be chaos teams here for this upcoming season. And two of the SEC teams that Tom cited were both Auburn and Florida. And Tom's reason for citing this in the particular piece are the kinds of teams that both Auburn and Florida get a chance to play. And if you want to look at just percentage of opponents who are kind of in the top 20 of national championship odds and things like that, both Auburn and Florida are kind of right there on that. And while I don't think clearly neither Auburn or Florida is good enough to be in the college football playoff conversation, could one of these teams potentially be good enough to ruin someone else's playoff chances? I think there's a possibility that could indeed be the case. Certainly in the case of Auburn, who I think is probably on paper better than Florida. But once again, when you look at Florida, who this year gets to play Utah, gets to play an LSU, we'll count Georgia here on this, we'll count Tennessee here on this. You know, Billy Napier is a coach that needs a win. Billy Napier is a coach that needs some sort of trophy to put on the wall for the Gators here this year, and oftentimes a tough schedule is a problem as it relates to some of that kind of stuff. But in the case of Billy Napier, the schedule and the types of good teams with playoff aspirations that Florida gets a chance to play, that could also work to be the kind of thing where he gets the sort of win that kind of quiets some of the anxiety around Florida fans and perhaps gives him a chance to sort of live on for 2024 and perhaps beyond. So interesting stuff there from Tom Fornelli looking at both Auburn, Florida, and their chances of maybe ruining someone else's playoff possibilities. In the case of Auburn, you've heard me say this before, I also think that they very much are the kind of team that could pull an upset here this year. Very much the kind of team that could get somebody before it's all said and done. You've seen their over-under total somewhere in the neighborhood of, 7, 6.5 some places, maybe as high as 7.5 maybe somewhere else. Either way, I think this is an Auburn team this year that can go 8-4. I do. Have a successful first year with Hugh Freeze. So I guess from that standpoint, I probably agree with Tom Fornelli there on that. I'll also mention this there, too. You may have seen some reporting about Texas A&M and its NIL fund. This is a little bit confusing. Texas A&M is not shutting down its NIL operation. They are shutting down a particular NIL fund. And what this is related to is you may have seen like a memo from the IRS the other day about like 501(c) status basically, and like using a donation of NIL fund as a tax deductible type situation. The IRS said, no, you're not going to do that. And so some of these funds that were kind of sort of set up to take NIL payments as old school donations where you got some tax benefits for that, schools like Texas A&M are now saying, okay, we got to rethink all of this. And there's going to be more of that conversation that comes out there. So Texas A&M is not shutting down NIL, but they are shutting down that particular fund. And speaking of shutting things down, we'll go ahead and bring our music down and shut down our SEC through for now. We were going to do some other stories, but instead, let's talk to Mr. College Football himself, Tony Barnhart, here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Meriwether and Tharp today. Always a fun time to have Tony on the show, and we certainly appreciate that. Tony, hope you've had a good summer. I know you've been traveling around, speaking to touchdown clubs and things like that. That it is always a signal that the season is basically here. So we're happy to have you out there doing all that kind of stuff and here talking some college football with us here today, too.
Well, thank you, Brandon. It's we're getting close. I've been to a couple of trips to Alabama, one in North Carolina. We'll be going down to Mobile. And people are very excited about this season because this is going to be a very interesting season, particularly when you consider the fact of all the change that's coming next season.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, this sort of feels like the end of an era in many ways. Playoff change coming in 2024, SEC change coming in 2024, and then beyond that, 2025, whatnot, you've got even more change. Some of that maybe we haven't even fully anticipated yet, and we'll obviously touch on some of that before we're done here. But while all this sort of wildness happens, Georgia just keeps right on sailing, two-time national champions, an opportunity to win a third here this year. I think it's probably some comfort for UGA fans. They're not a participant in some of the chaos that seems to exist other places. But, Tony, I think people are sort of finally now start to understand just how historic a feat it would be if Georgia were to win it all again. We've never seen anything like it. Do you think that the context has been properly established yet of just how significant it would be if Georgia in this era of intense competition were to be able to win a third straight national championship?
Well, it's interesting. I was at a function with Coach Steve Spurrier, and we got to talking about that. He said, you think Georgia can do it? I said, yeah, I think they can do it. But it's hard to win one. It's almost impossible to win two in a row. And put the three in a row, the only historical reference we have is 1936 in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And so the odds are very much against you because the odds would be against anybody. But I think everybody understands that Georgia has what I have said every place I've gone. I said, look, can Georgia do it? Yes, they can do it because they have the talent to win another national championship. Doesn't mean they will. A lot of great talented teams. But Miami in 2002, they had won the national championship in 2001, and they had a great football team, but things didn't fall into place against Ohio State. So I think the context is there, Brandon, but it's gonna be fun watching them.
Please tell us, because I know our audience wants this to be true, that Coach Spurrier is so disappointed about the possibility of Georgia winning 3 straight national championships. Obviously, something that he wasn't able to do during his career. Please tell us that he is certainly worried that might become reality, because I think Georgia fans would be comforted to know that.
I don't think he was worried about it, but we did find it an interesting topic of discussion.
Good to know there, I guess. As far as the rest of the SEC goes, I thought it was interesting the coaches poll had Tennessee 10th, because, that's certainly a little bit higher than where I have them right now, just given the changeover quarterback, given the fact that some of the way too early polls probably had them more in the neighborhood of, say, 15th. I think that's probably a little bit more realistic than the top 10 that the coaches poll had them at. And I also think the coaches poll kind of got it wrong with Alabama ahead of LSU. For the life of me, I don't quite know what has happened over the course of the last 12 months to make Alabama on paper better than LSU, a team that beat it last season, other than the fact that, of course, the game this year is in Tuscaloosa. What do you make about that sort of next level of competition in the SEC just under?